companies like dairy companies, scope 3 is up to 95% of all their greenhouse gas emissions. And that's mainly because it comes from cows. And then for climate nerds like myself, the scope 3 is often termed as someone else's scope 1 and 2. But what it really means is that a company can control quite a lot by choosing its partners.
Welcome to Podcast and Business. I am Juan Carlos Giraldo from Boston, United States. How can organizations take actions on net zero? Organizations should have real ambition, mission, purpose, vision, and commitment to make an impact. To discuss climate actions and net zero in organizations, today our guest is Douglas Maret. Douglas is based in Copenhagen, Denmark, and he is the CEO of GH Sustainability. Also, he is the founder of Enablesus, a company that empowers our world by linking the transparency of sustainability between consumers and organizations. Hello, Douglas. I am so glad to have you today as a guest on my podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and sharing some information with everybody today.
In this episode, we will focus on climate actions and net zero in organizations. Douglas, many governments and companies have as a goal reduce the greenhouse gas emission by 2030. And this goal is to move to a net zero economy, in many places around the world. And so in some places, for example, in UK, are low, So let's talk about organizations at net zero. In all of size, what is the best approach to communicate climate actions and net zero in the organizations? Any kinds, medium, small, or the big corporates, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And after dealing with this topic for almost 20 years, it really comes down to two sides. And even though we say in the corporation or looking inside the corporation, the truth is we're also looking outside the corporation at the same time. So for example, inside we know that 6 out of 10 employees, they're motivated by companies that match their values. And then outside the organization, we also know that, for example, consumers, around 6 out of 10 consumers, are also looking at climate change as an important issue. So even when we communicate inside the organization, we're actually communicating outside as well. And to get more to the depth on your question, when we look at these both sides, it really comes down to three things that you have to communicate. The first is an organization needs to communicate how it's setting and what is it setting for its climate-related goals. And this is its both short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals and targets. You mentioned net zero, so like a lot of companies have their long-term goal of reaching net zero. The second component is identifying what actions the company is going to take and showing both internally and externally what those actions are. So how are you going to meet those goals? And then, of course, the third component is measuring. So you really need to measure the results and then share those results with the public. And for corporations, this really comes down to a strategy. And corporations need to develop these strategies. A lot of large corporations have already done this or are doing it. And then they tend to communicate those strategies either separately as a press release or in their annual reports. And a lot of medium and small companies are just starting that process.
Exactly. Today, Douglas, is crucial to consider as a goal, global goal. I call this, to reach this, is a global goal in all companies, regardless of the size. Companies, organizations should implement and analyze and work, even though in R&D, on climate and interactions with societies, as you mentioned, customers, shareholders, and stakeholders as well. Forget these goals, we need to work in align with the scopes 1, 2, and 3. Would you mind to define the scope 1, 2, and 3 and why, briefly, why they are so important within the organizations?
Scope 1, 2, and 3 really comes down to control, and it's based on you mentioned sort of standards in the process. So scope 1, 2, and 3 comes from something called the GHG protocol, which is an international standard that's been used for nearly 2 decades. And scope 1 is kind of the high level direct control that a company has on their emissions. And basically it's the emissions of all the fuel and the energy that the company itself produces, and also any vehicles the company may have. Scope 2 is a high level, let's say indirect emissions. And this basically means that they can control indirect emissions through the electricity that they purchase or the heat and cooling that they purchase, because that actually comes from a different organization. So
Correct.
Scope 3 is what I call sort of the medium or low level of indirect control. And this is where you have the GHG emissions from activities that include the organization's supply chain, but there are also activities that are from goods and services from other parties. And roughly, if you want some examples, it's, for example, employee travel. It could be the lifetime emissions of an electric car that you produce. So that's also scope 3, because it's no longer in your facility. So that's really the main point. And what's important about these is that there's, of course, new regulations that are coming into account. And in these regulations, both in terms of reporting regulations like the EU's non-financial reporting directive, and of course the new US Securities and Exchange Commission has a new proposal that sort of matches these rules and the EU reporting that companies need to report on their climate change impact, the impact they're putting on climate change, which is their greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1 and 2 and 3, but also the impacts that climate change has on the business. Mm-hmm. And there's a second set of rules that most people don't realize called the green claims rules and regulations. And the US has these, the UK has them, the EU does, but the leaders right now are the UK and Denmark, where now they're requiring these, corporate strategies and corporate accounting of scope 1, 2, 3. If a company is going to say, oh, we're climate friendly, or that, we're shooting for, a climate goal, you actually have to have these strategies publicly available. And scope 1, 2, 3 is really the core to that.
Let's dig a little bit in the scope number 3. In my humble opinion, I think I read a lot about the importance of the scope number 3. I think it's a crucial one. Why should an organization measure the scope 3 emissions, and how would this help them to improve, the goal itself, in your opinion?
It's mainly because for a lot of organizations, scope 3 is where they have their biggest impact on climate change. So I'll just give you some numbers, because some people like numbers.
I do like numbers.
In a lot of So in a lot of professional service companies, like accounting and marketing and engineering, almost 85% of their emissions is scope 3, usually through travel. Fashion brands, it's also 85%, because all their apparel is manufactured by somebody else. And then companies like dairy companies, scope 3 is up to 95% of all their greenhouse gas emissions. And that's mainly because it comes from cows.
Exactly.
And then for climate nerds like myself, the scope 3 is often termed as someone else's scope 1 and 2. But what it really means is that a company can control quite a lot by choosing its partners. So a company can control its scope 3 by choosing who it uses as a supplier or not. So for example, that fashion brand I told you about, they can partner with a manufacturer that uses 100% renewable electricity or recycled materials.
Correct.
But they can also, contract a delivery service that only uses electric vehicles or green hydrogen vehicles. So they have a lot of control, or organizations have a lot of control on their scope 3 to a certain extent.
Yeah, so important what kind of partners we have, the company have, if we are speaking right now about the scope 3. You just mentioned the word reporting and regulations, and I think some companies are still struggling how to report. However, I read a very, very excellent report in your company, Enablesus, called Close the Gap. Although it's indeed focused in the Danish market, but I would say many of the outcomes that I read in this excellent report have similarities with United States or other countries. Let's talk about this Close Gap report in your company. What were the primary outcomes that you guys found?
Yeah, the Close the Gap report was actually quite interesting because we look at the behavior. Yeah,
It's very
we
interesting.
use we try to look at the behavior of both consumers and businesses, and therefore the gap in between. And on the consumer side, we found that basically 5 out of 10 consumers want more transparent sustainability information. For example, information on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions from products and companies. But only about half of organizations feel that they're actually getting appreciation from sharing that information. At the same time, 9 out of 10 consumers prefer to use different means on how they're collecting information from companies, like websites and so forth, particularly websites that combine information. But organizations are mainly only reporting on their climate goals and their mitigation and so forth and their emissions on their own website. So they need to shift basically to more kind of these common tools. At the same time, from consumers, about 5 out of 10 are looking at information on the sustainability and climate impacts while they're purchasing. And 5 out of 10 are looking, let's say, before they purchase, and 7 out of 10 while they purchase. So, but they're only using like 2 minutes. So it's really important that a company communicate their sustainability impact, but also their climate change impact, really within a narrow time frame.
It's very, very interesting, this report. Before to jump to the next question, Douglas, why reporting has becoming like a difficult task? I feel sometimes for a companies that reporting, is a difficult. They don't know how they start, or they don't know where is the best approach, or they don't know what data they should use. In your opinion, why become that? Because in your report and Close the Gap, 9 of 10 social media and business believe that reporting sustainable actions will give them a stronger profile and brand. However, still some companies are struggling with that. Why is that?
Yeah, I think it really comes down to some extent the size of the company, but it's the same problem whether you're a small company or a large company, and it's simply the fact that they're not used to the resources that are needed.
Oh, I see.
So it's a tremendous amount of effort that has to be done. Greenhouse gas reporting isn't as big as ESG reporting in general, but it is a lot of information, and you have to contact your suppliers. You need to
tracking
really. Yeah. So you have to create those whole holistic systems, and when we do this for governments, we call it MRV, which is monitoring, reporting, and verification, and I can tell you for governments it takes many years.
Yeah.
And I know for companies it can take large companies a few years to create these systems, and for small companies you can do it in a few months actually.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Speaking about ESG, what is your opinion about the role of the CEOs in ESG metrics? You are a CEO. I am reading a book called Net Positive, Paul Polman.
Yeah.
Great. It's a great book.
Yeah.
Try to create a movement. The main goal is we have to work in ESG metrics on sustainable goals as well as a long term. However, still some companies want to do the short term. What is your opinion about these ESG metrics, like environment, social, and governance? What is your opinion about the role of the CEO in ESG?
Yeah, I mean, if I look at it from a management standpoint, then really the CEO is crucial to ESG matrices and sustainability in general in the organization, but also the board of directors, because up until now they're not really heavily involved, but they should be. Really heavily involved, but they should be.
They have to.
Yeah,
certainly.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. But and soon it's part of regulation. So the board of directors have a responsibility in that sense. But for the CEO, the main role is to lead the culture. And in the book you mentioned, really highlights how that happens. So it's really to lead culture for including sustainability or sustainability inclusion, and to be the champion inside an organization. And the reason why is because the CEO has to be that key facilitator, because making ESG happen from both an information system standpoint, but also ensuring measurable impacts, is quite a lot of effort. And with ESG reporting and impact, you have a lot of coordination that has to be done between business units, and many of those business units are traditionally working in silos. So the company has to, and the CEO has to focus on creating these new processes and also piggyback on existing processes. And the CEO is well positioned to foster that critical element and being the champion in that system to get it done.
Exactly. Yesterday I read another report. I am not in mining field, but these companies present a very interesting ESG report. And one of the case where, for example, they plant trees around the mines, 0 cases of COVID within the employees, capacitation, of the employees about, exploration, geology, health, safety, ESG itself, and etc., which makes the role of the CEO very important. Douglas, would you like to add anything to this conversation that probably our listeners want to listen, or probably you want to share more about Enablesus and another thought that came to your mind right now?
Yeah, I think there's a few important things, but one core topic. So the climate change component is quite clear. There was this recent report that came out by IPCC that basically says it's now or never, which really means that organizations and consumers and governments really need to function and work together now. But the cold hard truth is that climate change is very much linked to many ESG areas. When you impact the climate in one way, it actually impacts maybe a social or a governance issue as well. So it's really that core issue. And when you look at something like this consumer and corporate connection, which is why we established Enablesus, so that companies could actually share their ESG information in short bits for consumers, companies really need to recognize that consumers have the power of the purse, and they're becoming more aware, they want more information, and they can make the decision. So if your company isn't following and addressing climate change, if it isn't actively working on ESG and a transparent system around that, your company's going to be left behind in the end.
Exactly. And you know what? Something I found very interesting. The customers, they don't talk anymore about price. They don't care price. They care how you, as a company, as a brand, take care of the planet. So this is unbelievable. Before, years ago, probably in the old marketing, old management, everything was a price, right? But in this time, not.
It's a really, another cold hard truth. I think New York University Stern, they had a study recently that basically showed that 50% of all the consumer product growth is from sustainable products.
Exactly. It's so interesting. Douglas, where people can contact you or reach you, your company, or learn more about Enablesus?
Well, you can find us on the web, of course, in Enablesus.com, and that's Enablesus.com.
Mm-hmm.
And for me personally, you can find me on LinkedIn. Just type in Douglas Maret. I think I'm probably the only one or two in the whole world, so it's pretty easy to find.
Correct. This is correct. That's fine. Okay, Douglas, I would like to say thank you for your time.
Thank you as well.
I'm JC Giraldo from Boston, United States. Thank you so much to everyone.